In a recent Waxer report, I talked about 6 Days in Fallujah, a military FPS that was set to release more than a decade ago and was meant to be a realistic depiction of the Second Battle of Fallujah, a grueling and deadly fight during the ever so controversial Iraq War that was one of the most bloody battles in all the near decade of fighting for American troops and civilians, which saw 95 soldiers and 800 innocents lose their lives. From the fighting also came a conspiracy that alleged the United States in using a deadly compound known as white phosphorus on civilians when attempting to flush out insurgents in the city. Other atrocities are also linked to the violent fighting, such as threatening to shoot and kill young men who looked fighting age to American troops. Really, the Iraq War was one that had multiple reasons to be seen as abhorrent by the American people and all others involved. And when the game was originally set to release, the media was not here for it. The controversy surrounding the game was inspired by the not yet ended war, retaliation from the families of fallen soldiers who fought in the battle, and the fear that the game would only end up glorifying the events that took place, painting the United States troops as nothing but heroes rather than showing the murkiness that is often associated with the war. And because of this controversy, Konami pulled their support from Atomic Games, the smaller dev team working on this project. After that, the game was scarcely heard of, with the developer swearing for years that it wasn't cancelled and would in fact release one of these days, only for it to never really come to fruition. Fast forward to now, the early months of 2021, and now we have publisher Vectura and developer Haywire Games, the revived Atomic Games, largely composed of ex-Halo and Destiny developers, re-announcing the return of the controversial title. And when I covered it, I believed that Haywire was actually going to explore those muddied waters of warfare. When you looked at all the work the devs had done, which included having scans of real-world soldiers who partook in the fighting, conducted hundreds of interviews with both soldiers and civilians who saw the fighting, and a promise to donate a portion of the proceeds to charities and organizations that would benefit those affected by the fighting more than 17 years ago, you'd believe that the title was going to be different than what people were afraid it was going to be. And 6 Days in Fallujah just might be the realistic modern military shooter that doesn't glorify the deeds of the United States military, instead addressing the controversy surrounding the fighting in the Iraq city. However, in a recent Polygon interview with Peter Tampt, head of Ventura, about their vision for the narrative of the upcoming military shooter, Tampt responded that this will not in any way make some form of political commentary and would not be focusing on, or at all addressing, the questionable actions of the military and higher command chains, and will be sparsely focusing on the civilian experience. While the game will have you play as a man trying to lead his family out of the fighting, it is a very small percent of the game in which you'll do so, with the rest being focused on the fighting instead. To say I'm disappointed would be an understatement. Ventura and Haywire, you guys had the ingredients laid out in front of you. You took the steps in what could have helped you make a truly groundbreaking experience that really went after what it was like to be there, that critiqued the actions of higher authorities, addressed the effects the fighting had on soldiers and civilians alike in a greater context. Instead, you decided to go the typical route. Instead, you decide to focus mostly on this tired black and white morality that not only is rarely acceptable in the genre, but certainly isn't applicable to what this war was. Now, of course, 6 Days in Fallujah isn't out now, so I don't truly know how the game will be from start to finish, but hearing the developer talk about how they want to shy away from questioning authority, like directly say that they don't want to question authority, and completely dodging the questions surrounding white phosphorus, which Tampt explained that since they hadn't talked to any soldiers that experienced it, they wouldn't be able to depict it, a rather bogus cop-out. My hopes for 6 Days in Fallujah and what it could have been reduced, as well as my excitement for this upcoming FPS. And it's with this recent update about 6 Days in Fallujah that makes me want to talk about military shooters, FPS, and the like on a broader scale, particularly about their subject matter. The genre seemingly too often veers away from making players really ask the tough questions or depict the actions of the supposed good guys in any negative light. The recent Modern Warfare reboot was supposed to be that for Call of Duty, with multiple games media websites addressing the potential controversy it could stir. With its release, however, it seemed like they didn't quite hit that mark. Skillup has a great video on that, which I'll include down in the bio below. The genre isn't completely devoid of this, however, as there is one game that remains the shining beacon of bleakness in its depiction of war-related violence when things get way out of hand, and that's 2012's Spec Ops: The Line. In Spec Ops, you play as Captain Walker and are joined with your squad mates Lieutenant Adams and Staff Sergeant Lugos, and are sent to a sandstorm-devastated Dubai to find another company that was there saving civilians after disobeying orders to return after their stint in Afghanistan, instead helping in the relief effort. You quickly learn that the 33rd have gone rogue and started rounding up civilians by the dozen, and that the CIA are also involved, but are trying to put an end to their actions. When it is then revealed that the leader of the 33rd is John Conrad, the commander who led Walker during his tour in Afghanistan and saved his life, your mission changes to help civilians and find Conrad in an effort to get him to stop the 33rd. What then ensues is a game that forces you into making decisions that more often than not have unwanted outcomes. The most notorious of scenes, though it's not really a choice, has you and your squad come across an encampment with dozens of soldiers in armored vehicles. Nearby you find a mortar with white phosphorus shells, and, not without immediate refusal from Staff Sergeant Lugos, who knows of the weapon's destructive effects, fired the projectiles at the soldiers. What follows is a rather grisly scene that has you move across the aftermath, listening to the wailing cries of pained, dying, and dismembered soldiers, one of which informs you in his dying breaths that they were helping civilians and that the gate was a refugee camp. It is then that you discover that not a single survivor, 47 in total, including children, survived the shelling. Talk about heavy. Though that is certainly the most shocking moment in the game's entirety, it doesn't shy away from much after that. Walker begins to slip further and further from reality, often having visual hallucinations due to the guilt he's riddled with after the shelling of civilians. The relationship he has with his fellow soldiers falters tremendously as they start to argue and shout at one another and question his leadership. There's even a scene later in which, after Lugos is killed by a mob of angered civilians, you have to make the decision of letting them go or gunning them down out of revenge of your fallen mate. The game circles themes such as always having a choice, and that your actions, no matter how in the moment they may seem necessary and mean life or death, that the outcome might result in some major consequence. Consequences that may very well change how you view yourself as well as the causes that you're fighting for. Spec Ops: The Line is a game that didn't shy away from doing the unthinkable. In its 5 hours, it showcases some of the most grueling moments the genre has ever seen, and honestly hasn't seen since. The devs over at Jaeger truly made something special, and it's wholly unfortunate that no other dev has decided to come forth and really try to recapture these themes or even expand on them with real world parallels. And honestly, it's that latter point that really pisses me off even further about 6 Days. It could have been the depiction of actual real events. There could be dozens of games that spoke on the themes with the same weight as The Line, but the one key thing that they would all be missing is the true-to-life depiction that 6 Days could have offered. It could have used the fact that it has real-life soldiers and interviews from hundreds of actual people who lived through the hell that the fighting was. Instead, it seems that 6 Days will be trying to cater to the general FPS audience that won't at all care for it, most likely be controversial in a completely unintentional way, and just seen as a game that could have shaken things up, but didn't, and shied too far away from really being something truly groundbreaking. A crying shame, really. This has been Waxo, and until next time, take it easy.